You picture a Viking the way movies taught you to. A horned helmet, a roaring longship, an axe raised against a burning sky. It's a good image. It's also almost entirely wrong, and so is the ending you've been told. The Vikings didn't vanish in one final glorious battle. The real answer is far stranger. They didn't lose a war. They lost the climate. Think about what you actually know about the end of the Viking Age. Probably something vague about a battle in 10th century England. Maybe a defeat. Maybe a king dying. That's not nothing. But it's not the reason an entire seafaring culture stretching from Newfoundland to Baghdad quietly stopped being Vikings at all. To understand what really happened, you have to stop looking at swords and start looking at the sky. For nearly 3 centuries, roughly 793 to 1066, Norse raiders, traders, and settlers expanded outward from Scandinavia in almost every direction. They reached Iceland, they reached Greenland, they reached the coast of North America, 500 years before Columbus. This wasn't luck. It was climate. Historians and climatologists studying ice cores and tree rings have identified a period called the Medieval Warm Period, a stretch of unusually mild temperatures across the North Atlantic lasting from roughly the 9th century to the 13th. Warmer seas meant less sea ice blocking northern sailing routes. Warmer summers meant longer growing seasons in places that are brutally cold today. Climate scientist Astrid Ogilvie, who has spent decades studying Iceland's historical climate records, has shown that this warming window is exactly when Norse settlers pushed furthest into the North Atlantic, founding colonies in places that would become nearly unlivable a few centuries later. Greenland is the clearest example. Around 985, Eric the Red led Norse settlers to Greenland's southwestern coast, and they built farms, churches, and a functioning society that lasted for centuries. Not a temporary outpost, a real, working colony raising cattle and sheep on land that today sits largely under permafrost. That alone should make you pause. A land now defined by ice-supported herds of livestock for 400 years. Something had to change for that to stop being possible, and something did change. Beginning around the 13th century and accelerating sharply after, global temperatures began shifting into what's now called the Little Ice Age. This wasn't a sudden ice age in the dramatic sense. It was a slow, grinding, cooling trend lasting for centuries. But it hit the Norse settlements at exactly their most vulnerable point, the edge of what was survivable. In Greenland, growing seasons shortened. Hay yields, critical for keeping livestock alive through the winter, began failing more often. Archaeologist Thomas McGovern spent much of his career excavating Norse Greenland sites, and his research on animal bones found something telling. Over generations, the bones show herds shrinking, cattle being slaughtered younger, and eventually a shift toward hunting seals and other wild game, a sign of a society straining against an environment that had stopped cooperating. Here's where it gets stranger. The Norse in Greenland didn't just face a colder climate. They faced it while committed to a way of life that made adapting almost impossible. Unlike the Inuit populations living nearby, who hunted seals and whales as a primary food source, using kayaks and toggle harpoons perfectly suited to Arctic conditions, the Norse identity was deeply tied to European farming, cattle, and a social structure built around land ownership and church hierarchy. Adapting fully to an Inuit lifestyle wasn't just a practical shift. It would have meant abandoning what made them who they were. Anthropologist Jared Diamond, drawing on this archaeological record, argued that Norse Greenland's downfall was as much cultural as environmental. A colder climate created the crisis, but rigid social identity determined how badly that crisis was handled. The Norse kept raising cattle they increasingly couldn't feed, kept building churches while starving, and kept trading for European status symbols even as basic survival became harder. Ask yourself what that really means. A society didn't fail purely because the world got colder. It failed partly because changing who they were felt more dangerous than starving as who they'd always been. By the mid-1400s, contact with Norse Greenland went silent. No dramatic battle, no recorded final massacre. Just the last written accounts trailing off and archaeological layers showing a population that had already been shrinking for generations, malnourished, isolated, and increasingly cut off from trade ships that could no longer reliably reach them through worsening ice. Iceland tells a related but less fatal version of the same story. The Little Ice Age hit Icelandic farming hard, too, shortening growing seasons and increasing volcanic disruption to an already thin margin of arable land. Icelanders survived, but only by transforming, leaning harder into fishing, adjusting settlement patterns, and enduring centuries of hardship that reshaped the culture into something notably different from its Viking Age beginnings. Even in Scandinavia itself, the broader Viking identity, built on long-distance raiding and open-water expansion, gradually dissolved as trade routes shifted, kingdoms consolidated, and Christianity restructured Norse society from within. The end of the Viking Age wasn't a single defeat. It was hundreds of smaller failures to adapt fast enough to a climate that had quietly stopped being an ally. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. For 3 centuries, a warming climate acted like an open door, and an entire culture expanded through it with astonishing skill and ambition. Then the door began closing, slowly, unevenly, over generations, and the societies that couldn't or wouldn't change with it simply stopped existing in the form they'd always known. Not through conquest, through a climate they never controlled and, in the end, refused to fully adapt around. So the next time you picture a Viking longship cutting through open water, remember what actually made that possible in the first place, and what quietly took it away. It was never really about the axe. It was about the ice. And what happens to any people, ancient or modern, when the climate that built their entire way of life stops being generous?